Chicago had always been a restless city. Its residents read daily newspaper reports about high-profile crimes committed by local gangsters. However, on February 14, 1924, the city was shaken by an event that went down in history as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. As law enforcement later established, the events unfolded as follows. The gang of local bootlegger Bugs Moran had gathered at a warehouse on the north side of the city. They were planning to receive a shipment of alcohol for storage and later distribution. It's worth noting that the warehouse was well disguised, and local residents had no idea that gangsters were hiding illegal alcohol there. The meeting of Moran's men was scheduled for 10:30 a.m. But something unexpected happened. A police car pulled up to the secret warehouse, and two officers stepped out. The criminals didn't even try to run. They were confident they could bribe the police or come to some kind of agreement. The officers ordered the gangsters to drop their weapons on the floor and line up against the wall for a search. Once again, this seemed like a routine procedure, one the gangsters had been through more than once. But instead of conducting a search, the police officers opened fire at point-blank range. 6 gangsters were killed on the spot, and another died 3 hours later. City bystanders rushed to the scene after hearing the gunshots, and were amazed at how quickly the police had acted. No one present realized that the 2 officers were actually gangsters themselves, members of a rival gang. They had simply obtained police uniforms and stolen a patrol car. Sometime later, detectives pieced together the evidence and concluded that the crime had been orchestrated by none other than Al Capone. The road to the top of the criminal hierarchy was never easy, and the story of Alphonse Gabriel Capone is clear proof of that. He was born into a family of Italian immigrants who moved to New York from Naples. Besides Alphonse, Gabriel Capone and Teresa Raiola had 8 more children. The head of the family worked as a barber, while the mother was a seamstress. Of course, they couldn't give much attention to all the children, so they spent most of their free time on the streets of Brooklyn. Although Alphonse was sent to a Catholic school, he didn't stay there for long. His violent temper showed itself early. When he was just 14 years old, Capone brutally beat a teacher for constantly reprimanding him. The school administration could no longer ignore his behavior, and he was expelled with no chance of returning. Strangely enough, this didn't bother young Alphonse at all. The streets became his real school, and he was more than happy to return to them. At first, Capone tried to earn money honestly. He worked as a delivery boy in a candy shop, then took jobs at a bowling alley and a pharmacy. But none of this brought serious money. Capone wanted real cash, and fast. That desire pushed him toward petty crime, and with shady people. One of them was a young man named Johnny Torrio, known by the nickname, the Fox. At the time, Torrio was a promising gangster of Italian origin, who already led a small gang of young criminals, called the James Street Gang. A few years later, Torrio managed to save enough money to open a billiard hall, which became the gang's real headquarters. The small-time gangsters from James Street were involved in robberies and theft. Nothing unusual for them. At the same time, many members of the gang still held legal day jobs. For example, Al Capone worked part-time as a bouncer at a bar owned by Frankie Yale, a close friend of Johnny Torrio. It was in this bar that Alphonse received the famous scar on his face. This is how it happened. One evening, a small-time gangster named Frank Galluccio came into the bar with his sister. Capone began smiling at the young Italian woman and making compliments toward her. She clearly disliked the attention and complained to her brother. Frank was already quite drunk, and Alphonse's behavior toward his sister seemed insulting to him. He demanded an apology and, in a fit of rage, pulled out a knife and tried to stab Capone in the neck, but missed. The blade struck Capone's cheek instead, and after Alphonse fell to the floor, Galluccio fled the bar together with his sister. Later, Capone received stitches, but the deep scar on his cheek left by Galluccio would never disappear. A few days later, Al Capone approached several mafia bosses, asking them to restore justice and punish Galluccio. However, the leaders of the crime families were conservative men, and after hearing both sides, they unanimously decided that Capone was in the wrong, since he had insulted the honor of a woman in front of her brother. As punishment, Capone was ordered to publicly apologize in front of witnesses. It is worth noting that the 12-centimeter scar remained not only on Al Capone's face, earning him the nickname Scarface, but also in his soul. For the rest of his life, Alphonse was deeply embarrassed by this incident, and later invented a story claiming that he had received the scar while fighting in World War I. In reality, Al Capone never fought in the war and never served in the army at all, something his closest associates knew very well. As mentioned earlier, Johnny Torrio was a highly promising gangster. He reorganized and strengthened the James Street Gang. It's also worth mentioning that the gang received a new name, the Five Guns. The exact number of members is hard to determine, but at the very least, the group numbered around 1,500 people. Naturally, as the gang grew, so did the scope of its activities. The Five Guns now provided protection for prostitutes, engaged in extortion, carried out contract killings, and organized illegal gambling. Many mafia bosses were well aware of Johnny's abilities, and as a result, the Fox regularly received lucrative offers. One day, Chicago Mafia boss James Colosimo invited Johnny to help settle certain family matters, and Johnny couldn't resist. He knew perfectly well that Colosimo controlled an entire network of brothels and moved serious money, which meant the job would be extremely profitable. Johnny immediately left for Chicago, leaving the New York operation in the hands of his subordinates. While Johnny was dealing with business in Chicago, Al Capone wasted no time. On the contrary, he focused on sharpening his skills. Capone was often seen in boxing gyms and underground shooting ranges, where the young gangster practiced with pistols and the legendary Thompson submachine guns. Still, his true passion was cold steel. He became a master of knife fighting and never hesitated to use it. These skills would serve Capone more than once. On one occasion, he clashed with gangsters from an Irish group known as the White Hand. The scuffle quickly turned into a bloody brawl, and Alphonse stabbed several of the attackers. This sparked outrage within the Irish gang, and they declared an all-out hunt for Al Capone. During one of the chases, they managed to corner him, but Capone kept his cool and drew his pistol. One pursuer was killed on the spot, while another managed to escape. From that moment on, a trail of blood followed Al Capone, and his problems began to grow like a snowball. The New York police could not ignore these crimes and began taking the Italian seriously. They opened a criminal case against him and summoned him to the local precinct several times. However, just before Alphonse was supposed to go to trial, the key witness in Capone's crimes suddenly lost his memory. He could not even remember the criminal's name, let alone his appearance, or any identifying features. At the same time, the evidence pointing to Capone also disappeared, and the case reached a dead end. Still, without his protector Johnny Torrio, Alphonse could not solve these problems. His death was only a matter of time, and the only way out was to flee New York. Capone called his mentor, the Fox, and explained how bad things had become. During the phone call, Torrio promised to help and said he would take Alphonse in Chicago. Soon after, Capone packed his belongings, took his wife May Coughlin and their one-year-old son Albert, and headed to the train station. Upon arriving in Chicago, Al Capone got a job as a bouncer at one of Johnny Torrio's new clubs, called the Four Deuces. The club offered every forbidden pleasure of the era: alcohol and women. The crowd at the Four Deuces was extremely rowdy, which meant Capone always had plenty of work. He had no trouble throwing violent customers out of the club and often went far beyond what was necessary. On one occasion, Alphonse became so enraged that he bit into a customer's carotid artery, and the man died before even reaching the exit. In addition to this, Capone often carried out killings on Johnny Torrio's orders. Typically, he would simply strangle his victims and then drag the bodies to the backyard, where a stolen car was already waiting. Of course, police frequently arrested Al Capone for brawls and disturbances, but he was almost always released, since they were paid off with large sums of money by the Fox. Overall, it could be said that everyone in Jim Colosimo's gang was satisfied. The police left the gangsters alone, criminals from other gangs didn't dare cross Torrio and Colosimo, and the money kept flowing like a river. But nothing good lasts forever. The established order suited Jim Colosimo perfectly. He lived large, constantly bought new cars, and threw lavish parties. In fact, it's fair to say that Jim had no intention of changing anything. On the contrary, he did everything he could to keep things exactly the way they were. This situation deeply frustrated his ambitious partner, Johnny Torrio. The Fox always wanted to expand the illegal business and increase profits. Day by day, the arguments between Colosimo and Torrio only grew worse. Neither of them was willing to back down. On top of that, the Fox was furious with Jim Colosimo for his inability to stay in the shadows. Jim attracted too much attention from journalists and the police, and that was bad for business. When the conflict reached a dead end, the Fox made a desperate decision: Jim had to be eliminated. Colosimo was shot dead at the entrance of his own restaurant. Who pulled the trigger remains unknown. According to one version, Johnny Torrio assigned the job to Al Capone. Another version claims the killer was Torrio's longtime friend from New York, Frankie Yale. Either way, after Jim Colosimo's death, the Fox immediately took control of the gang. He moved quickly to seize new territories and had no problem clashing with rival groups. Torrio's first major focus was the production and distribution of alcohol. This task was assigned to his most trusted lieutenant, Alphonse Capone. By that time, Alphonse was already a well-known figure in Chicago's criminal world, and many called him Big Al. The Fox's organization was making over $100,000 a week. These weren't just big profits. They were staggering sums of money. It's also worth noting that around this time, Al Capone contracted syphilis from one of his prostitutes. Moreover, he never sought medical treatment, and over time, the symptoms appeared to fade. This would later play a critical role in Capone's life, but we'll return to that story later. Of course, not everyone was happy with how well Capone and Torrio were doing from the illegal alcohol trade. Soon enough, others wanted a piece of the action. The first serious rivals of Johnny Torrio and Al Capone were the Irish gangs of the North Side, led by O'Banion, Doherty, and Bill Moran. The Chicago gang war escalated slowly at first. Initially, the Irish and Italian gangs robbed alcohol warehouses and hijacked liquor shipments. As tensions grew, members of rival groups began beating each other in bars and clubs. When the conflict reached a boiling point, the gangs turned to firearms, explosives, grenades, and of course, Molotov cocktails. During the gang wars, all of Chicago echoed with violence. Gangsters attacked each other in broad daylight, anywhere in the city. Car bombings became especially popular. All it took was turning the ignition key, and the vehicle would explode instantly. Beyond that, the gangs had no problem luring rivals into traps, poisoning them, or turning them over to the police. In short, every possible method was used. The gang wars claimed not only ordinary soldiers but also the leaders themselves. For example, at one point the Irish secretly arranged the sale of one of the bootlegging breweries. They found a front man who negotiated the purchase with Johnny Torrio. To finalize the deal, the Fox personally came to inspect the underground brewery. But at that exact moment, the police arrived and caught Torrio red-handed. Overall, the plan was carefully thought out, but the Irish failed to consider one crucial fact: half of the city's police force was in Johnny Torrio's pocket. As a result, Torrio was released just a few hours after his arrest. This move enraged both Al Capone and the Fox. They hired a skilled gunman who lay in wait for Dion O'Banion outside a flower shop. As one of the leaders of the Irish Mafia stepped out carrying a bouquet of lilacs, the assassin fired several precise shots, and O'Banion collapsed, already dead. O'Banion's position was immediately taken by Henry Weiss. The new Irish leader decided to retaliate at once. He tracked down Johnny Torrio and pulled up alongside his car, opening fire with Thompson's submachine guns. The Fox's driver was killed on the spot, but the Italian boss was far luckier. He escaped with nothing more than shock and 3 bullet holes in his hat. In fact, every shot passed just inches from his head. Torrio's apparent invulnerability only fueled the Irish gangsters' rage, and they planned another attempt. This time, the assassins were far more efficient and managed to seriously wound Johnny Torrio. Even so, doctors were able to save the Italian Mafia boss. After leaving the hospital, Torrio's outlook on life changed completely. Once he recovered, the Fox decided to step away from the business, a decision that came as no surprise. He was already an aging man and dreamed of a quiet, comfortable retirement. He had everything he needed to make that dream a reality. All that remained was to leave the gangster life behind. Of course, the position of the Italian Mafia boss could not remain vacant. At a meeting of the organization, Joe Torrio announced that the new leader would be Al Capone. With the Fox gone, the gang war did not end, it only intensified. Big Al sent his hitmen after the Irish almost every day. Still, many of these crimes went largely unnoticed by the public. Until the event the press would later call the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. On that day, Al Capone delivered a crushing blow to the Irish Mafia. He couldn't destroy it completely, but the message was clear: the Irish knew their place and never challenged him again. That is how Alphonse Capone became the King of Chicago.